I had been maintaining the relay station at Cathara Point for 28 years when the Vrath Reclamation Syndicate arrived. I want to be precise about that, because when people later asked me what happened that morning, they wanted the dramatic version. They wanted me to say I felt it coming, or that I had spent 3 decades preparing for that exact moment, standing tall with some warrior's clarity about what I was doing out there on that coastal plateau with a calibration kit and a thermos of cold coffee. The truth is simpler and, I think, more honest about what we had become by then. I was replacing a corroded signal capacitor on the outer relay housing when I heard the atmospheric disturbance signature that meant something very large had entered the upper atmosphere. I noted the time in my maintenance log, 6:12 local, and went back to the capacitor. That was the state of things at Cathara Point after 900,000 years of preparation. An old woman with a wrench who had heard that sound before. My name is Marin Souls. I am 63 years old. I have worked for the Earth Signal Authority's Coastal Relay Division for 28 years, the last 19 of them as Senior Station Engineer at Cathara Point, which sits on a limestone plateau about 40 meters above what used to be called the Adriatic Sea. The sea is gone now, its basin long since transformed by geological work into a broad terracotta lowland that the Continuity Survey maps as the Adric Basin. I mention this not because it matters to what happened, but because I think it is useful context. The Earth that the Vrath Reclamation Syndicate arrived to claim as a dormant biosphere asset was not the Earth they had last surveyed. That survey had been conducted 912,000 years before this morning, and at that time, by all documented accounts, the plateau where I was drinking cold coffee had been the floor of a shallow inland sea. Cathara Point Relay Station is not an impressive facility by most standards. It is a low concrete building with 3 antenna towers, a subterranean power coupling to the regional grid, and a 2-person operations room that doubles as my workspace. On a clear day from the roof, you can see the full breadth of the Adric Basin to the west, and on the western horizon, the pale gray edge of the Thessaly continental platform. To the north, the coastal highlands run their limestone ridge. To the south, the Cathara lowland freight terminus handles the transit traffic for the southern corridor, and the air traffic above it is constant enough that I have stopped hearing it the way you stop hearing a river after a while. It becomes part of the sound of the air itself. It is quiet work, relay station maintenance. There is something to check or replace or recalibrate most days, but not in a way that requires urgency. The machinery is good, and the ESA has always run its maintenance schedules carefully. In 19 years, I have had 4 significant equipment failures, and resolved all 4 before the backup systems engaged. I am proud of that record in the way that people who do good quiet work over long years become proud of the consistency of it rather than any single moment. I had not told anyone that morning about the atmospheric disturbance signature I had heard, not because I was keeping it secret. The ESA Operations Board picks up those signatures automatically, and Pelvoras would have seen it the moment it entered the upper atmosphere, but because there was no useful thing to say until it resolved. I noted it in my log, continued the capacitor replacement, and trusted that the relevant people were doing what they were supposed to be doing. I finished the capacitor replacement. I sealed the housing. I stood up, brushed the limestone dust from my knees, and looked west. The ship was enormous. Even at altitude, even filtered through the morning haze that sits over the Adric Basin in summer, it was unmistakably larger than anything I had grown up thinking of as a vessel. It was descending on a shallow approach vector, which told me the crew was either cautious or had been briefed to expect local air traffic. There is a good deal of air traffic out of Cathara Point. The eastern freight corridors alone carry something like 2,000 sorties a day, and it was broadcasting on the Open Planetary Emergency Channel, which told me something else. They had arrived expecting to announce themselves to whoever might be listening. They were not expecting much of a response. I pulled out my handheld and opened the ESA Operations Channel, Cathara point to Eastern Air Command. You're seeing this on the board. Seeing it, said the duty officer. Her name was Pel Voras, a young woman 4 years into her posting, and her voice had the particular quality of someone who has just been handed a situation that is considerably larger than her daily expectation. We have them at 48,000 meters and descending. Configuration matches the Vrath Syndicate registry file. You're in the projected landing envelope. I know, I said. Any word from the continuity division? They're aware, standing by. I stood there on the plateau with my thermos and watched the ship come down. It was a blocky thing, more utilitarian than any vessel I had seen in 28 years of watching spacecraft from that plateau, and it was ancient. That was the thing that struck me first. Not the size. I have stood on the open deck of a continuity-class human warship and watched the hull division engineers conduct exterior maintenance, and nothing that came out of the sky that morning was larger than what we had at home, but the age. The hull plating was pitted in a way that spoke of enormous age and many atmospheric entries, and there were stress fractures in the port dorsal rib structure that had been repaired so many times the repair material had itself been repaired. Whatever the Vrath Reclamation Syndicate had been doing for the 912,000 years since their administrative masters at the Koreth body had first logged Earth as a dormant biosphere asset, it had been hard work. They set down on the flat section of the plateau about 600 meters north of my station. The landing burned a clean black circle in the limestone and raised a wall of dust that I watched drift south on the morning wind. When the dust settled enough to see clearly, I walked toward them. I want to be honest about this part too. Walking toward a Vrath landing site was not something that any reasonable human being would have done in certain periods of our history. I am aware of that. I have read enough of the early contact theory documents, the ones my grandmother's generation wrote when the first survey records were recovered, to understand that there had been a time when a Vrath Syndicate ship landing on a populated world was an event that ended the population. The Vrath were not warriors in the way that word implies a certain restraint. They were deathworlders in the truest sense that the Koreth administrative body used that designation. A species evolved on a high-gravity, high-radiation world with a gravity well 2.5 times Earth standard, where every biological process had been under selection pressure for lethal threat response since before their civilization was old enough to build tools. They were the most feared physical combatants the Koreth body had ever contracted. There was not a species in the body's 14,000 world registry that had stood against a Vrath Syndicate deployment and come out ahead. What the ESA contact files are careful to note, because they are careful files written by careful people, is that the Vrath's fearsome operational history is not about cruelty. They are not a species given to cruelty in the way the old contact theory horror stories implied. They are a species for whom physical superiority is so complete and so thoroughly assumed that most of their cultural framework for dealing with other species is built around the premise that resistance is not a viable variable. The worlds in the historical record that had ended badly not because the Vrath were vengeful, but because the Vrath had assessed resistance as non-viable and acted accordingly, the way you act when something is not a meaningful factor. The correct response to a Vrath deployment in those cases had not been resistance. The correct response had been to not be in the category of things the Vrath were assessing as potentially resistant. We were not in that category. I knew this with the particular confidence that comes from having read the relevant files carefully, and from understanding what 900,000 years of very deliberate preparation actually looks like when it is standing in a limestone plateau on a summer morning. I knew all of this. I had read the files. The ESA has excellent files. I walked toward the ship. The ramp came down on the western side of the hull, and 4 of them came out first. I had seen photographs in the technical briefings that the ESA circulates every 5 years, updated as contact theory intelligence comes in from the continuity survey ships, But photographs are one thing. In person, the Vrath are the kind of creature that the older parts of your brain respond to before the rest of you has finished processing what you're seeing. They stood between 2.5 and 3 meters tall, which was not the most unusual thing about them. We have neighbors in the Continuity Survey Registry who run taller. What the photographs do not prepare you for is the texture of them. Their integument is somewhere between scaled and armored plating, with a color that shifts from deep gray to a brownish gold depending on the angle of the light, and they move with a kind of compressed, deliberate quality that communicates, even when they are standing still, that they are in a state of constant physical readiness. Their eyes are large and set wide, adapted for a low-light environment, and they track independently. Standing 50 meters from 4 Vrath contractors, who have just stepped off a reclamation ship, is an experience I would describe as clarifying. The one in front was carrying a documentation tablet in one hand and a field scanner in the other. That told me this was a lead assessor, not a combat element. The documentation tablet is the Vrath Syndicate's version of a calling card. They are, in their way, a professional outfit, and they believe in paperwork. The Korath administrative body requires it. Behind the assessor, the 3 others had the particular stillness that I recognized from the technical briefings as a combat readiness posture. Weight evenly distributed, hands visible but not extended, the faint tension in the shoulder integument that means they are reading the environment. I stopped about 20 meters away and raised my hand. Not a wave, a held-up open palm, which is the Korath body's registered neutral greeting form for first contact situations with species of unknown affiliation. I had practiced it in the ESA orientation course 19 years ago and had not used it since. The lead assessor stopped walking. We looked at each other for a moment. Then I said in Korath Standard, which is the trade language that the body uses across its registry, "You are on Earth. ESA Cathara Point is authorized to receive your docking notification. Do you have documentation?" There was a pause. I do not think the assessor had been expecting Korath Standard. "You speak the body's language," the assessor said. It was not a question exactly. It was more the tone of someone who has found something in a place where they did not expect to find it, careful, a little wary, recalibrating. "Korath Standard," I said. "Yes, we've been teaching it for about 400,000 years. Some of the older texts are better in the original High Korath, but the standard is sufficient for most purposes." Another pause. The field scanner was oriented toward me. I let it scan. "The body's registry has this biosphere designated as dormant," the assessor said. "Status code, unregistered, pre-sapient, biological value tier 4. The last survey notation is 912,000 years old." "I'm aware," I said. "The ESA has a copy of that notation. We filed an update request with the Korath Survey Division approximately 408,000 years ago." The scanner moved. Not much, a fraction, but I caught it. The assessor was no longer looking only at me. The scanner had shifted to take in the plateau behind me, and specifically, I suspected, what was on the horizon behind the plateau. I did not turn around. I knew what was there. I had walked to work past it every morning for 19 years. "Your update request," the assessor said slowly, "is not on record in the syndicate's operational file." "We submitted it to the survey division," I said. "Processing timelines for pre-sapient notation corrections are listed at between 300,000 and 600,000 years for species that have not been granted continuity body observer status. We have been observer members since approximately 80,000 years ago. I can forward you the registration confirmation if that would be helpful." The scanner had stopped moving. The assessor was very still. One of the 3 behind him said something in the Vrath contractor dialect, rapid, clipped, the consonant-heavy cadence that their coordination language uses when they are in an active assessment situation. I have a working knowledge of Vrath contractor dialect from the ESA language division's training modules. What was said was approximately, "There is something in the sky above the northeast." I said, still in Korath standard, still to the assessor. That would be the morning freight run out of Thessaly platform. The eastern corridors handle about 2,000 sorties before noon. It gets busier in the afternoon. The assessor turned his head slowly and looked northeast. I turned with him because it seemed polite. The Thessaly platform freight run was, as it always was at that hour, a formation of 18 carrier-class vessels moving at low altitude on the eastern track, their hull lights still visible against the morning sky. They were not military vessels. They were civilian freight carriers registered to the Adric Basin Trade Cooperative, and they moved with the comfortable lumbering efficiency of ships that have done the same route so many times the crew barely looks up from their instruments. Behind them, higher up and further north, the morning patrols from Cathara Station were moving in their usual pattern, 3 continuity-class light defense vessels, which are small by our standards, but which I knew from the technical specifications, ran approximately 4 times the hull mass of the Vrath ship on the plateau. The assessor looked at the sky for a long time. I poured myself some coffee from the thermos and waited. "How many individuals inhabit this world?" the assessor said at last. "About 14 billion on the surface," I said. "Another 2 billion across the orbital platforms and the lunar stations. We don't count the deep system settlements in the surface census, the belt communities and the outer system infrastructure crews, but the continuity survey's population assessment from the last census put the total at something like 22 billion. Give or take." The assessor's integument had shifted. I noticed it the way you notice a change in light not consciously until you have already registered it. The brownish gold had receded. The gray was more prominent. In the Vrath physiology, according to the ESA technical files, a shift toward the gray end of the integument range indicates elevated cognitive load. It is not fear exactly, because fear in the Vrath system is processed differently. It is something closer to the experience of encountering a situation that your operational planning has not accounted for. The body's file class for this world is dormant biosphere, the assessor said. Reclamation contract number 84773 is filed under that classification. I understand, I said. We are aware of the contract. The Continuity Division's legal office notified us when the syndicate filed the work order, which was about 60 years ago from our end. There was some time between when we received the notification and when you arrived. We used it. Used it how? I set down my thermos on the relay housing beside me. I reached into the front pocket of my work kit and took out a document wallet, actual printed material, the old kind, on archival-grade polymer sheets, because the ESA legal division has very particular views about what constitutes a durable record. I held it out toward the assessor. He did not take it immediately. He looked at it the way a cautious person looks at something placed in front of them by someone who is being very calm in a situation that does not seem to call for calm. Then he took it. "What is this?" he said. "A copy of Earth's Continuity Observer Registration," I said. "The original is filed with the Korath Body's Observer Registry, reference number E4449712. The second document is the updated biosphere notation, which was filed with the Survey Division under the ESA's Observer Member Authority approximately 400,000 years ago. The third document is the Sovereignty Continuity Declaration that the ESA filed under Observer Member Protocol Article 12 at the time of our registration. That's the provision that allows long-established civilizations with observer status to retroactively correct pre-sapient notation errors covering the period of their development. The fourth document is the Korath Body's acknowledgement receipt for all 3 filings." The assessor was reading. His integument was deeply gray now, in a way that I thought might be past the cognitive load range, and into something the ESA files did not have a clean label for. This acknowledgement receipt, he said after a long pause, is dated. 80,000 years ago, yes, I said. It took us some time to navigate the body's administrative processing, but it went through. Behind him, one of the three had moved, not toward me, a lateral step, to get a wider angle on the plateau. I understood why. The view from the north edge of the plateau on a clear morning takes in the full western horizon, which at Kethara Point includes the upper third of the Thessaly continental platform, one of 6 in the Adric Basin region, and not the largest. The Thessaly platform is a land-based megastructure, which is not the right word for it exactly, but the word I find most people reach for when they see it for the first time. It is a raised operational platform covering approximately 40,000 square kilometers, built over a period of about 60,000 years beginning approximately 200,000 years ago, and it sits on the western horizon at Kethara Point like a second horizon, a hard line of gray-white infrastructure that at this hour has the morning sun behind it and throws a long shadow across the basin below. The freight carriers you can see from the plateau are departing from its eastern freight deck, 200 kilometers away, which is why at this distance they look small. They are not small. The smallest of them displaces more mass than the Vrath ship on the plateau behind me. The Vrath contractor who had moved laterally was looking at the Thessaly platform. I let him look. The Thessaly platform deserves a word, because it is easy, when you have grown up near it, to lose your sense of what it actually is. My grandmother used to say that people who had never seen it were better positioned to understand it than people who had, because the people who had seen it from birth had been quietly habituating to it since childhood and had forgotten how to register what they were registering. She had spent the first 20 years of her life in the interior, where you cannot see it from the surface, and she had arrived at the coastal division on her first ESA posting and stood on the roof of the transit accommodation and looked west and not said anything for about 15 minutes. She told me this story several times, and each time she told it, she described the specific quality of those 15 minutes, which she said was the quality of the mind performing a very rapid but very comprehensive recalibration of scale. The Thessaly platform is a land-based megastructure that covers approximately 40,000 square kilometers of what was once the western end of the Adric Basin, and it sits on the horizon at Kethara Point, not the way a building sits on a horizon, but the way a second horizon sits below the first one. A hard line of gray-white infrastructure that in the right light appears to be a different piece of sky, a sky that is the wrong color, and at the wrong angle and has too many right angles in it. In the morning it is in shadow from its own eastern edge, and in the afternoon the sun catches the forward faces and they glow. At all hours, in clear weather, you can make out the freight platforms on the eastern deck, which at 200 kilometers appear as small raised points that you might mistake, if you were not familiar with the scale, for equipment mounted on a distant building. They are not distant equipment on a building. They are larger than the Vrath ship currently sitting on the plateau behind me. There are 6 such structures in the basin region alone, I said, because I have always believed in being straightforward. There are 43 on the surface globally. The Continuity Survey classifies them as Class 4 permanent infrastructure. The orbital platforms add another 19 at various altitudes. We stopped building the heavy mass structures about 30,000 years ago and shifted to the ring architecture, but the old ones are still in service. The assessor had lowered the documentation wallet. He was looking at me with an expression that, and I want to be careful about projecting human emotional categories onto Vrath physiology, because the ESA briefings caution strongly against that, seemed to me to carry the quality of a professional who has just reviewed a contract and realized that the situation it describes and the situation they are actually standing in are not the same situation. The syndicate was contracted under a dormant biosphere designation, he said. Reclamation of dormant biosphere assets requires no consultation with current biosphere inhabitants under body regulation, because dormant biosphere designation implies the absence of civilization-grade inhabitants. Correct, I said, which is why the notation correction is important. Earth is not dormant. Earth is an observer-member civilization with a continuous governance record of approximately 940,000 years. We date our continuity from the point of first documentation, not from Koreth body recognition, and a classified infrastructure tier of Class 4. The reclamation contract was filed against a notation that ceased to accurately describe this world before most of the structures you can see behind me were built. The assessor turned and looked at the plateau behind him. Then he turned back and looked at the plateau behind me. Then he looked at the sky, where the morning patrol was completing its eastern arc and turning for the northern transit. I picked up my thermos. "Would you like to sit down?" I said. "I have a second chair in the relay station. It may not be the right size for your frame, but I can put a crate out. The coffee is cold, but the water is good." He did not sit down, but he did not leave either, which I took as the kind of answer that the moment warranted. What happened over the next 4 hours is something I have described in the formal ESA incident report, which runs to about 60 pages, and which I am told is now part of the standard orientation package for relay station engineers in all coastal divisions. I will give you the shorter version, which is the one I give when I am not under a documentation requirement. The assessor's name was Vrath Syndicate Designation Kovrath 7318, which in the contractor hierarchy corresponds to something between a senior field assessor and a middle-tier operational commander. He had been running reclamation contracts for the syndicate for what he told me was the equivalent of about 6,000 of our years, which in Vrath biology represents early to middle career. They are a long-lived species. He had conducted 412 prior contract actions. He had never, in 412 prior contract actions, arrived at a target world and had the local maintenance engineer hand him a legal filing that superseded his contract. He was professional about it. I want to be clear about that. Whatever stories there are about the Vrath in the historical contact records, and there are some that are difficult to read, from the worlds that did not have the time or the preparation that we had, Kovrath 7318 was a professional. He read the documentation. He ran the authentication codes on the observer registration against the Koreth body's open verification system, which I had known he would, and which is why the ESA legal division had made sure the filing receipt included the body's public authentication key. It came back valid. He ran it again. It came back valid again. He sent a transmission to the syndicate's administrative relay. I did not listen to it directly. That would have been discourteous, but I was within range of the channel and have a reasonable working knowledge of Vrath contractor dialect, so I caught the broad shape of it. He was reporting an anomalous contract status. He was describing the observer registration and the notation correction. He was, and this is the part that I think is important to preserve accurately, telling his administrative relay that the biosphere asset designated under Contract 84773 was Class 4 infrastructure and observer member civilization, continuous governance record in excess of 900,000 years, an indeterminate number of surface inhabitants in the billion range, and an indeterminate number of orbital and deep system installations. He used the Vrath contractor dialect word that the ESA language division translates approximately as substantive, which is the operational term the syndicate uses to describe a situation that has exceeded the planning parameters of a contracted action. He used it several times. At about an hour into this process, Pel Voras on the ESA operations channel checked in with me. "Everything still calm out there?" "Calm," I said. "He's doing his due diligence. It's going to take a while." "The continuity division has a legal team on standby if you need them." "I don't think I'll need them," I said, "but thank them for the offer." The morning freight run completed its second pass. The patrol ships made their transit and were replaced by the midday watch, which at Cathara Point means a heavier configuration. The Eastern Patrol runs 3 lights in the morning and 5 heavies in the afternoon, because the afternoon window is when the deep system freight arrives from the belt communities and traffic control gets complicated. The 5 heavies came up from the south in loose formation and settled into their transit pattern at about 60,000 meters altitude. A continuity-class heavy defense vessel is not built for elegance. The hull design prioritizes mass distribution and reactor access above any aesthetic consideration, and the result is a ship that looks, at a certain angle in certain light, like a large moving building with the lights on at noon. 5 of them in formation at 60,000 meters altitude means they are visible as a line of shapes against the high blue sky, and the hull mass of each one, from the plateau, subtends a visible angle that most people, when they first see it, describe with a pause in the middle of whatever sentence they were forming. Kovrath 7318 was watching the sky when the heavies transited. He did not say anything. He watched the 5 shapes move across the eastern arc, and his integument did the thing I had been watching it do all morning, the slow recession of the gold, the deepening of the gray, and when the heavies had completed their transit and were moving north toward the Thessaly platform freight corridor, he turned back to me. "How long have you had that configuration in place?" he said. "The midday patrol. It's been standard since the Continuity Division formalized the inner system defense architecture. That was about 140,000 years ago. Before that it was lighter. The heavy configuration came in when the outer system installations were completed, and we had the hull capacity to run it continuously." "I mean the ring." I looked up. The ring is not always visible from the surface, depending on the season and the angle of the sun, but in the midday summer sky at Cathara Point it is visible as a line, a faint, slightly curved line, pale against the blue, that runs from the eastern horizon to just past the zenith before it descends below the western horizon. On a clear day, which this was, you can see the freight handling platforms on the inner surface face as slightly thickened points along the line. Most of the civilians in the coastal region grow up not noticing it, in the way you stop noticing something that has always been there. I had stopped noticing it about a month into my posting. "The ring went continuous about 60,000 years ago," I said. "It took about 120,000 years to build the full circumferential loop. There was an earlier partial structure, about a third of the circumference, that the first generation built when they were still developing the mass delivery logistics. The current structure is the second generation. We rebuilt about 40% of it when the Material Science Division upgraded the primary load-bearing systems." Kovrath 7318 looked at the line in the sky for a long time. I poured the last of the coffee into my cup, which was cold and had been sitting in the sun too long and tasted like something you drink not because it is good, but because the act of drinking it is familiar and settling was what the moment called for. I had finished my morning maintenance work. The capacitor was replaced, the relay housing was sealed, and the diagnostic system was running clean. By any objective measure, I had completed my shift tasks and could have gone inside. I stayed outside because it seemed like the right thing to do. "Your filing," Kovrath 7318 said at last, "supersedes the contract under body regulation." "That's our understanding," I said. "The legal division can discuss the specific regulatory reference if that's useful. They're very thorough, and I expect they've been looking forward to it. The contract cannot be executed against a current observer member civilization." "That's our understanding, yes." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that surprised me slightly, because it was not the kind of thing I had expected the senior field assessor of a Vrath Reclamation Syndicate ship to say. He said, "How did you know we were coming?" I thought about that for a moment. Not the answer, I knew the answer perfectly well, but about how to frame it. The honest answer is not complicated, but it has a weight to it that I have always wanted to handle with some care. The Korath body's work order registry is public, I said. Contract 84773 was filed 63 years ago. We received a notification from the Continuity Survey Division when it was posted, because Earth is a registered observer member, and the body notifies observer members of pending actions against assets in their system. We had 63 years between the notification and your arrival. You used 63 years to prepare. We used 63 years to make sure the paperwork was in order, I said. The preparation itself has been ongoing for considerably longer. The documentation we gave you this morning is current. The infrastructure behind it has been building for about 900,000 years. Kovrath 7318 looked at me. Then he looked at the Thessaly platform on the horizon. Then he looked at the ring in the sky. Then he looked at the 5 heavy defense vessels completing their northern transit. Your kind, he said carefully, were listed in the Korath body's original survey notation as a pre-sapient biological population of undetermined complexity. We were, I said. That was an accurate description at the time. 900,000 years ago. Give or take, yes. Another silence. The morning sun had shifted to late morning, and the light on the Adric basin below the plateau had changed from the flat early brightness to the deep amber that comes in the middle of the day, when the light has a weight to it and the shadows go hard at the edges. I have always liked that light. I spent most of my adult life working in it. The Vrath Syndicate has conducted 412 contract actions, Kovrath 7318 said. In 412 contract actions, we have never encountered a situation of this classification. I imagine not, I said. The combination of a pre-sapient notation and a 900,000-year development window is not common. Most worlds either don't survive the window or don't have anyone coming back to check. You built this, he gestured, a wide movement that I read as encompassing the plateau, the basin, the ring, the patrol ships, the freight carriers, all of it, without knowing if anyone would come. I thought about that for a moment. We built it because it was worth building, I said. The old records, the ones from the first generations after the contact theory documents were written, they're very clear about this. The people who started the work did not know if they would live to see it mean anything. Most of them didn't. It took a long time before the continuity survey even confirmed that the body existed and that the original survey notation was a real document. Some of the early generations thought the whole thing might be a misreading of an ancient data cache. They kept building anyway. The ones who came after them kept building because the ones before them had, and because by then it was the kind of work that had become part of what we were. You build long enough and you stop building for a reason and start building because you are the kind of people who build. Kovrath 7318 was quiet for a long time after that. At about the 3.5-hour mark, he sent a second transmission to the Syndicate Administrative Relay. I had by then moved my chair outside and was running a secondary diagnostic on the relay station's eastern antenna array, which had been giving slightly irregular readings in the overnight logs, and which I was reasonably certain had a loose junction in the secondary feed cable. I was not listening closely to the transmission, but I caught enough of it to understand its shape. He was requesting a contract status revision, the Vrath term for what happens when a contracted action encounters a regulatory barrier that prevents execution. It is, as far as the Syndicate's billing practices are concerned, a non-actionable contract. The Korath body will refund the filing fee to the client, and the Syndicate will absorb the operational costs of the deployment as standard business variance. In 412 prior contract actions, Kovrath 7318 had never filed a contract status revision. He filed one now. The administrative relay's response came back in about 40 minutes. I could not hear the content, only the cadence, but Kovrath 7318 read it, and then stood for a long moment with the transmission unit in his hand, looking at nothing in particular. Then he put the unit away and walked back toward where I was sitting. "The syndicate accepts the contract status revision," he said. "The action against Earth designation in Contract 84773 is closed." "Thank you," I said. "The ESA Legal Division will forward the official acknowledgement to the Koreth body's contract registry this afternoon. I expect you will receive the body's confirmation within the standard processing window." He stood there for a moment. The afternoon watch was beginning to set up for the freight management window, and the sky to the east was getting busier in that particular organized way that freight corridor management looks from the outside, ships moving in lanes, the geometry of it clean and purposeful. "I have one more question," Kovrath 7318 said. "Of course. Your people in the early period, before you had confirmed that the body's document was real, before you had the continuity survey access, before you could be certain that anyone would ever come back, what made you start?" I set down my diagnostic kit. It is a question I have thought about more than once over the years, in the way that you think about the things that were done before you arrived, that you inherit and carry forward without having been part of making them. The early contact theory documents are part of the ESA's core training curriculum. I have read them many times. There is one in particular, a memo from the first director of what eventually became the ESA, a woman named Verith Solon, who wrote it approximately 920,000 years ago, in the years after the first partial translation of the survey notation, when no one was certain whether the document was authentic or what it implied. She wrote it for the people who would come after her, most of whom she understood she would never meet. I can quote it from memory because the ESA asks its senior engineers to read it as part of the annual continuity ceremony, which I have attended 19 times and will attend again in the autumn. She wrote, "We do not build because we are certain anyone is watching. We build because we are the kind of people who build for the long count. If no one ever comes back, we will have built a world worth living in. If someone does come back, we will have been ready. Either way, we will have been honest about what we are." I told this to Kovrath 7318. He listened to it. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Your director wrote that before you had confirmation the body was real." "Yes," I said, "about 12 years before, from what the historians have worked out." He looked at the ring in the sky again. The afternoon sun was past the zenith now, and the light was coming from the west, and the ring was catching it at an angle that made the freight platforms glow at their edges. It is a beautiful thing, the ring, in the right light. I have never entirely stopped noticing that. "The syndicate has a record," Kovrath 7318 said slowly, "of every world it has contracted against, 412. Of those, how many do you think refused the contract on legal grounds?" "I don't know," I said. "The syndicate's contract records aren't public." 7, he said. "In 6,000 years of my operational career, 7 worlds have had grounds to refuse under body regulation. 4 of them had recently achieved observer status with Koreth assistance. 2 were under active diplomatic protection from continuity body member civilizations. 1, he paused, filed its own documentation." "Was that us?" I said. "That was 800,000 years ago," he said. "A small world in what the body maps as the outer Vereth arm. They had been observer members for about 200 years at the point of contact. Their documentation was 3 pages and covered 1 provision." "Did it hold?" "It held," he said. "They are still there. I understand they have about 1 billion inhabitants now and a Class 2 infrastructure rating. They are, by the standards of the body's registry, a successful small civilization." I thought about that for a moment, in hours. He looked at the plateau. He looked at the basin. He looked at the sky, the ring, the patrol formation, the freight corridor traffic, the distant line of the Thessaly platform on the western horizon. He looked at me. "Your documentation," he said, "was 412 pages. The legal division is thorough," I said. "It covered 17 separate provisions of body regulation," he said. "It included a full 900,000-year infrastructure development record with Class 4 certification from the Continuity Survey. It included the Observer Registration, the Sovereignty Continuity Declaration, the Notation Correction filing, and the acknowledgement receipts for all of them. It also included," he paused again, "a pre-filed contract dispute notice under body commercial law, dated 60 years ago, which anticipated this exact contract action and cited the specific regulation under which it was non-actionable." I finished my coffee. "The legal division," I said, "has been anticipating this conversation for about 60 years. When was the pre-filed notice prepared?" "The first draft was about 300 years ago," I said, "when the Continuity Survey flagged the syndicate's commercial activity in the Outer Body Registry as a potential future interaction vector. They updated it periodically as the relevant regulations changed. The final version was filed with the body's Commercial Dispute Registry about 60 years ago when the work order was posted." Kavreth 7318 was quiet for a long time. Then he said something in Vrath contractor dialect that I did not catch all of, because it was quiet and partly directed away from me, in the way of someone talking to themselves more than to the person beside them. The part I did catch translated approximately as, 300 years to write a brief for a conversation that hadn't happened yet. I did not respond to that, because it did not seem to require a response. He folded the document wallet carefully. He had been holding it, I realized, for the entire 4 hours, and put it inside the field kit on his belt. He looked once more at the sky, in the deliberate way he had been looking at things all morning, like someone making sure they have correctly registered what they are seeing before they move on. "We will depart," he said. "The syndicate's administrative relay has confirmed the contract revision. The action is closed. You will receive the body's formal confirmation in the standard window." "Thank you," I said. "Safe travel." He started back toward the ship. The 3 others fell in behind him in the same way they had moved all morning, that contained, deliberate quality that never quite resolved into rest. At the bottom of the ramp he stopped and turned back once. "The director's words," he said. "The woman who wrote the memo 920,000 years ago." "Verith Solon," I said. "She knew your kind would become this." I thought about it honestly, the way I try to think about things that deserve honesty. "I don't think she knew," I said. "I think she decided." "There is a difference." Kavrath 7318 looked at me for a moment. Then he went up the ramp. The ship lifted 20 minutes later. It did not leave quickly. It climbed on the same careful approach vector it had used coming in, reading the traffic, fitting itself into the gap between the afternoon freight corridor and the midday patrol extension with a kind of professional efficiency that I respected. At about 10,000 meters it turned east. At about 100,000 meters it was past the orbital infrastructure layer and in the open transit lane. Within an hour it was gone. I went back to the relay station and made a fresh entry in the maintenance log. I noted the time of departure, the contract reference number, and the outcome: non-actionable, documentation accepted, action closed. Then I noted that the secondary antenna feed was still showing irregular readings, and that I would need to replace the junction cable in the eastern arm before the overnight window. Pelvoras came on the operations channel. "They're off the board." "Off the board," I confirmed. "Legal division is asking if you need a debrief." "Tell them I'll send the incident report by end of shift," I said, "and tell them the pre-filed notice held." A brief pause. Then, from somewhere deeper in the operations center, I heard something that was not quite a cheer. The ESA is a professional outfit, and we do not cheer in operations, as a matter of professional culture, but which was the kind of contained, exhaled sound that people make when something they have been holding for a long time has resolved the way it was supposed to. I went and found the junction cable. The thing I want people to understand when they ask me about that morning, and people ask, because I have been giving this account in various forms for about 15 years now, at orientation sessions, and at the annual continuity ceremonies, and occasionally to historians who make the trip out to the coastal division to interview people who were there, is that nothing that happened was surprising to us. Not the arrival of the ship, not the Vrath contractors, not the contract. We had been notified 63 years in advance. We had the documentation. We had known, for the better part of 900,000 years, that the long work of preparation was for this kind of moment. Not for a war, not for a battle, but for the morning when something from the wider universe arrived expecting a dead world, and found instead a relay station engineer with a wrench and a cold thermos and 412 pages of legal filings in her work kit. Vareth Solin's memo ends with one more line that the ESA does not always include in the annual reading, because the ceremony tends to end at the passage I quoted to Kovrath 7:318. The full ending is, "Do the work, all of it, every generation." Not because the work will be finished. It will not be finished, not in any span of time one generation can see, but because the people who come after you deserve to inherit something that was done carefully, by people who understood what they were building toward. That is what it means to remember. I replaced the junction cable in the eastern antenna arm. The readings cleared. I sealed the housing, ran the diagnostic, got a clean result. I entered the completion in the maintenance log. I poured the last of the new thermos into my cup. The afternoon light was coming from the west now, and the ring was catching it at the angle that makes the freight platforms glow, and the patrol formation was completing its final arc before the evening watch rotation, and the Thessaly platform on the horizon was throwing its long shadow east across the basin where the old sea used to be. The work was what it had always been. The work continued. That was enough.